Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Geoff Shullenberger, and this is Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with one of Compact's contributors to discuss one of our articles. So I'm joined for the second time by Hamilton Craig, who is a columnist for us and has mostly covered American affairs, but this week has turned to Europe, where the National Conservatism Conference has been underway and has, it turns out, been far more embattled as an event than was predicted or expected. But this turns out to be, quite relevant to the much earlier history that Hamilton discusses. So, much of the article concerns not the present moment, but the state of Europe roughly 200 years ago in the post-Napoleonic era. So Napoleonic Wars had devastated much of Europe, and this is a period in which a new international order was established that was relatively effective at maintaining peace for some time, for much of the 19th century. So Hamilton, perhaps just to start, could you explain why it occurred to you that the post-Napoleonic era in Europe was a useful historical precedent for the current situation, and what the parallels are that you see between now and this period of roughly 200 years ago?
So the order that you're referring to is sometimes called the Concert of Europe, and it is a sort of alliance of great powers helmed by Austria and the Austrian minister Clemens von Metternich, and it is called in its day conservatism, and it's called conservatism because it is a reaction against the liberalism of Napoleon and a reaction against the French Revolution. And the essential goal is to create a kind of stable world order in which something like the rise of Napoleon can't happen again. And that means partly quelling liberal impulses and quelling nationalist impulses. And one of the most interesting things about this era that I think Sohrab Ahmari has commented on maybe in his newsletter is the way that liberalism and nationalism were very closely entwined, very, very deeply identified with each other as political ideas. The idea that Europe at this time is made up still to a large extent of multi-ethnic empires. There's Austria itself as an empire with multiple different language groups in it, and you also have this thing called the German Confederation, which should not be confused with a German state. It's not entirely made up of German-speaking people, and it's sort of a loose confederation of small states, which are also significantly controlled by Austria. And then, of course, you also have the Ottoman Empire, which isn't directly involved in this. You have the Russian Empire, which includes different ethnicities. And within all of these, you have nationalist movements. You have people who are trying to realize states where their own people can be sort of unified in a single state and can determine their own destiny. And that is very aligned with liberal ideas about government, with ideas about this sort of a natural right to self-determination, with ideas about popular sovereignty. And so at this time, you see a conservative movement that is basically internationalist, that is about trying to maintain a system of rules that include legitimate descent, rule by legitimate descent, meaning rule by hereditary monarchies, the suppression of kind of liberal and nationalist propaganda, and a system where conflicts are solved by diplomacy through the great powers. In particular, for part of this period, there's a kind of triumvirate of Austria, Russia, and Prussia, Prussia is part of one of the states within the German Confederation. That's called the Holy Alliance, and these states together, which are Christian monarchist states, are going to kind of be the policemen of Europe and are going to enforce a rules-based order, which includes, that revolutionary politics, a la the French Revolution, are not legitimate and will be sort of crushed. So it's interesting to me. The thing that I began by being interested in is just this way that what you might call the first real political conservatism in Europe, because you don't really have such a thing as conservatism before the French Revolution. You just have sort of the way things are, and then the French Revolution unsettles that, and so then you have the development of people who are consciously conservative, who are trying to restore something of the old order, preserve what remains of it. The first conservatism was avowedly internationalist. It was avowedly rules-based. It was anti-nationalist, and that it's interesting to reflect on this and to reflect on how have we come to see internationalism in the form of the UN as liberal, how we come to see nationalism as conservative. The Concert of Europe system, inaugurated at the Congress of Vienna, is often regarded as a sort of precursor to the EU. So those are the questions that really interested me.
So 2 years ago or so, Sohrab wrote a piece called "The Return of Liberal Nationalism," which addresses this, and he points out that the deep commitment of various liberals to the Ukrainian national cause, which often takes the form of a quite virulent and even kind of verging on fascistic nationalism, is an interesting case of the way that there can be this kind of backdoor return to liberal nationalism, even among avowed internationalists. And then Timothy Snyder,
Yes.
he commented on recently, being another figure who's sort of in theory a kind of internationalist, but who wrote or who gave a speech in which he really proclaimed the sort of deep virtues of Ukrainian nationalism. And so, yeah, I mean, there is this odd affiliation that goes back really to the origins of nationalism as a liberal or radical cause, over and against this kind of cosmopolitan internationalist order that's established by these largely kind of aristocratic figures like Metternich, who's the focus of your piece, or one of the main points of focus of your piece, who is in a way a kind of prototype of these figures who we associate with Brussels today, right? Who are kind of these creatures of the politics of Europe rather than that of any individual nation state, right? And this is often coded today as being affiliated with all these progressive causes and so on. Europe is seen as, or the European Union is seen as, a progressive entity or a liberal entity. Now, I think there are, even within the history of the European Union, reasons to question this. It is actually kind of founded by largely conservative sort of oligarchical interests, right? Who are, essentially building it up as a sort of trade union within or a kind of trade confederation, I should say, within post-war Europe. And many of the kind of figures who oversee the building up of the European Union, into its current form, are certainly political conservatives in most senses of the term. Not reactionaries, but conservatives.
Yeah.
And so, and then, it's worth noting that we we also published a somewhat controversial piece by Thomas Fazzi that talks about the way that, I mean, even though I would say as I said, these figures aren't reactionary per se, there is a kind of odd continuity with certain ideas about how Europe should be governed that were developed by the Nazis, right, and by figures within the sort of wartime fascist elite. That the Nazis had an idea that Europe had to be unified, right, and governed in a unified way by the Reich, and so so they did have their own idea of what the European Union would look like. And then some of this was kind of taken up by and influenced the architects of the European Union. So there is this kind of odd, right-wing dimension of this project, which you can look at from several different angles.
It is. I mean, that's what's so interesting about it. I mean, there's my thinking, sort of in the pages of Compact, I'm continuing to think out various ideas. And at the core of this kind of question that I have right now is sort of what is a right wing position, or what is a conservative position? What is, if you sort of plunk Edmund Burke or somebody like that into today, what would they see as the conservative forces in society? And would it necessarily match our point of view? I was very intrigued by uh, when, as we should talk about that, the National Conservative Conference, which is part of the context for this, is shut down, and I guess has been revived now, but was shut down by police in Brussels. Mary Harrington, who has some affiliation with Compact, I believe, she tweeted that she was like, "This is really existing post-liberalism," and I thought that's very interesting, actually, because yes, it is. I mean, there's a way in which the EU is illiberal, or an action like that is illiberal, although we shouldn't mistakenly say that it was carried out by the EU. In some way, it was carried out by the mayor of Brussels. But post-liberalism, is in a way, maybe it's simply a response to the way that sort of mainstream politics already are, the way that they're being carried out, and the great irony on the right, to me, or the thing that's so fascinating about it to me, is this embrace of, particularly in the contemporary right, there's this kind of revived embrace of sort of elite theory, ideas of that come from Pareto, or Mosca, or Carl Schmitt, or these kind of things that were popularized by James Burnham. And of course, if you believe that, if what you believe is in a kind of unaccountable rule by an elite, and if that's the essence of right wing thought, and if that's the essence of then isn't the World Economic Forum, or the EU, or all these other institutions that people sort of rail against, don't they represent the accomplishment? Accomplished elitism, or accomplished post-liberalism, or I mean, that is, and the irony, of course, that everyone is sort of trying to find different ways to think about, and that I think Compact is one of the ways of thinking about, and other venues are different ways of thinking about, is how the quote unquote conservatives became the rabble, became the people, the movement, the whole idea. Even the idea of a conservative movement is almost a contradiction in terms. There's a movement, almost by its nature, belongs to the left. It's about rallying the people, whereas conservatism is about the way that somebody in a position of power conducts themselves towards the people. It's not about really building a movement. If you compare, like in American history, the Federalist Party versus the Democratic Republican Party, the Democratic Republican Party, which is kind of the left of early America, is made up of all these small clubs and all the organizations. The famous Federalists are not, they're not movement leaders. They're not rabble rousers. Somebody like Gouverneur Morris is not. You wouldn't think of him as a movement leader. These are elite gentlemen who are conducting themselves in a certain way towards the people, and all of all of conservative thought in a way, and far right thought, and it sort of was formulated initially in a context of being about defending the prerogatives and privileges of people who had power against an insurgent rabble. And the strangest thing has been seeing people try to apply that intellectual heritage to a situation in which they are the outgroup, they don't have power, and they are kind of the rabble. And the people who have secured power and are in those sort of unaccountable elite positions are the ones that they're trying to wield this fundamentally elitist kind of thought against. So that is an issue I'm always returning to. I think I've talked about in other places when I talk about, when I talked about, for instance, BlackRock, and I've written about that. It's the Metternich thing is so interesting to me because you see somebody defending from a conservative right point of view a system that in some ways resembles the EU, and you can see in some ways how very logical that is, how that defense is ultimately seems much more in accord with what we would think of as conservative thought than does the kind of language that people in the national conservative movement use, which sounds really, in the broadest sense, is, I would say, a movement of the left, the old left. Right.
So it's interesting to think here of a figure like Richard Hanania, who I think is maybe the clearest example of somebody who, more or less takes up the challenge that I think you just presented, which is, well, if you're a sort of reactionary or conservative who's invested in hierarchy and the rule of an elite and so on, then presumably you should like some of these organizations. So Hanania will sort of say, like, he learned to stop worrying and learn to love the World Economic Forum, right? And actually,
okay, I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
Sort of Klaus Schwab is based and all of this kind of stuff.
That's so interesting.
So I mean, there are some figures who will say yes, basically, and it's often tied in with this kind of IQ stuff where they'll sort of say yes, actually, the liberal elite, whatever disagreements we might have with some aspects of it, is still the higher IQ portion of the population for the most part, and therefore it's better that they're in charge and they're more competent, certainly, than any kind of populist rabble would be. So you do see a few people, but not many, kind of taking up this idea explicitly. And then but overall, I think what you're raising is really fascinating, that basically, I mean, sticking to the European context, national conservatism, there are various ways you could sort of critique it as a concept. One of them is that the nation state is itself a kind of, modern fabrication, and therefore, if you're conservative and your ideal is the nation state, then in a sense you're necessarily your conservatism doesn't go very deep historically, right? Because these nation states are, I mean, the thing that Metternich was trying to, the order that Metternich was trying to conserve was one in which in fact nation states were prevented from coalescing, right? In which you had this kind of hodgepodge of small principalities and city states in Italy and Germany, and in which you had, and it was really the liberal radicals like Garibaldi who were, struggling to bring them together into a nation state in the subsequent decades. And then if you had, multi-ethnic empires like Austria, right, which basically did not identify themselves as being, aligned with one particular sort of national identity, right? But rather as being the kind of stable the stable system that allowed different peoples to kind of coexist. And so and I mean, I'm generally kind of I remember reading like the great Austrian writer Joseph Roth, who wrote the Radetzky March and other novels, and he was kind of known as somebody who I mean, he was an Austrian Jew who basically saw the catastrophe of foresaw the catastrophe of nationalism as it would affect the Jews among others, right, in the 20th century, and had ended up having this kind of reactionary nostalgia for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right, because it could actually function as a multi-ethnic, as a kind of stable multi-ethnic arrangement, as opposed to, Balkanization and the necessarily incredibly unstable forces that were unleashed by the rise of kind of national movements. And so, I think what you're pointing to here is quite deep, which is that national conservatism is. I mean, there are many grounds on which to criticize the EU. You point to a few of them, that where the EU is really creating conditions of instability and kind of eroding people's ability to you know, have a decent livelihood and so on. We've published a couple things about the farmer protests, right, where the EU's sort of green agenda is promising to have very deleterious effects on European farmers, and that is clearly a kind of anti-conservative move because it, quite literally sort of threatens to undermine these tradition. I mean, not necessarily traditional, but these older ways of life on the land in rural areas, right? But on the other hand, nationalism is historically an incredibly destabilizing force, right? Just objectively, there is no way around that conclusion. And
Yes.
so, if you're a national conservative, it seems to me there is a contradiction there because nationalism has historically been extremely corrosive and of sort of any peaceful or stable order, particularly in Europe. And so if that this just seems like a clear kind of tension within the whole project.
Yeah, and I think that it seems clear to me that imperialism, not so much in the sense that it's more frequently used now to refer to an exploitative colonial relationship across a great distance, but imperialism in the sense of sort of federated land empires with, kind of levels of authority going up to an emperor and going down to various regional and local governing bodies is kind of that political system is the conservative political system. I mean, it partly because it's older, you know, than nationalism. I mean, if what you're conserving is something that had to come into being through revolution and through overthrowing an old order, how is that conservative? And because it is oriented towards stability, as you said, it's oriented towards it's oriented towards the same thing that I think all conservatism philosophically is oriented towards, which is caging impulses that are destabilizing and making them submit to something greater. And so to Metternich in his writings, one thing I'd like to talk about is how much we should think of him as a theorist or a thinker, and how much Peter Varick, who I wrote about, maybe errs in thinking of Metternich as a theorist. But to the extent that he justified the things that he did, a lot of it is that there's selfishness in humanity, right? There's like people are selfish, and the national conservatives have no problem understanding that within the nation. Within the nation, they're all about the common good, and they're all about they seem remarkably, I mean, they seem remarkably left-wing in a lot of ways. I mean, they're in favor of a level of regulation that is kind of that is striking, and they want the individual to subordinate their selfishness to the state. But why not say that the national community or the Volk or whatever you want to say should subordinate its selfish impulses to humanity, or to at least a smaller entity like Europe or the West or something like that? Because every bit as much as the individual selfishness in the marketplace or in the sort of marketplace of identity can be destructive of a national community. there is no doubt that the cravings for emancipation and latitude among a so-called national community can be extremely destructive of the community of humanity. And so to me, in some ways, the national conservatism seems like it imposes a sort of arbitrary stopping point on its conservatism. It stops, it stops at the national level, not at the level of humanity. And this is, of course, what they like. And this comes to another conflict about conservatism, which is universalism versus particularism. I mean, universalism has lately gotten this rap as like something that's really is this really liberal thing that we need to kind of that we need to do away with. And to me, well, okay, I think that's an interesting question. Whether does every nation just have its own unique nature and its own unique rules that apply to it? And because to me that also sounds an awful lot like what hyper relativistic left wingers say. And there's a real synthesis to me between a kind of left that, for instance, considers it illegitimate to criticize like female genital mutilation, that's an imperialist frame of mind. There's a synthesis between that and a kind of nationalist right, like an Alexander Dugin right that says we have our Russian truth, And so there's also something very just postmodern and relativist about this sort of nationalist right phenomenon that also strikes me as anti-conservative, because to me conservatism involves a sense of a higher authority all the way up to a highest authority that is decisive for all of humanity, not just for particular racial groups or for particular ethnic groups. And without that, it seems to me that you're engaging in, you have nothing left but kind of power struggle. And Peter Vurick, who wrote about Metternich, who I talk about, and there's an irony to this that I could touch on in a minute, but he was very critical of realpolitik, which he says is the complement of nationalism. And he describes it as the despair of anything better. And I think that there's a lot to be said about that once you accept that, the idea of a universal law, the idea of a universal humanity is a liberal fiction. We can only have any kind of sympathy or loyalty or responsibility to people that are quite similar to us. And in fact, our good has to come at the expense of someone else's good. There's a despair and a nihilism in that. And a kind of vulgar materialism that once again to me seems like anti-conservative.
Yeah, I think that's really provocative, and it strikes me, I was just at an event with Gladden Pappin, who's contributed to Compact and is works for an institute that's connected to the Hungarian government. So is kind of an insider to Viktor Orban's regime in some sense. And one thing that's kind of interesting there that also came out in a piece Gladden published with us recently is that that there is a kind of concern, that's the interests of American nationalism, right? And NatCon is a collaboration between American and European. I mean, the original NatCon was in the U.S. Now there are iterations in Europe, but basically, it is a collaboration. But one thing that's quite interesting is that some of the aims of American sort of national conservatives would be directly at odds with the aims of European national conservatives, and specifically.
That's what's so funny about it. There was an interesting thing about that, and that kind of touched on that. And I hate to cite these people, but I know but the Claremont Review, which was like, yes, there's such a funny thing about it, which is that it both is very particularist, is saying like each of us, each of us has our sort of own national being, and at the same time, there's this sort of universal set of principles that sort of nationalism writ large is good for everybody, and saying things that there's a great irony in somebody who would propose a kind of like Christian nationalism for the U.S., but would also say, but whatever religion you do it with is sort of equally valid. The most important thing is just that for your state, you should have some kind of like state religion. So it is this one size fits all model in some ways, at the same time as the model is one of particularism. And one consequence of that, as you point out, is you're asking everybody to adopt a model that places their own culture and their own aims as kind of as kind of exclusive, and obviously generates conflict. I guess in a way, it's like a national version of a sort of libertarianism, this kind of idea, do no harm, like as long do your own thing as long as you're not sort of stepping on anyone else's toes. Historically, obviously, that is not how nationalism has worked out. But there's also just this thing that's funny about it, which is that it's so it's just so deeply postmodern in that way, because it sees how could you have existing at the same time a kind of theocratic United States along with but that theocratic United States is built on the foundation of a political philosophy that also recognizes the legitimacy of all these other sort of theocratic states following their own religions and their own cultural imperatives. It's this kind of you've already sort of innocence has been lost at that point. The capacity to truly believe in your own program has been lost when it's part of a international doctrine. And does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I mean, concretely, what what Gladden points out is that a sort of bipolar world in which the US and China enter into a new Cold War threatens to be quite disastrous for Europe, right? That in fact, it's in the interest of a country like Hungary to, be able to have good relations with both China and the United States economically, diplomatically, et cetera. And so, a situation in which, in the name of a kind of resurgent nationalism in part, the United States kind of forces this bipolar confrontation and makes countries in Europe choose sides, threatens to be quite disastrous for countries like Hungary in particular, right, which are relatively small and, weak in the scheme of things. And so, I think that's hinting at that analysis is kind of hinting at the Metternichian approach that you're saying is needed, right? Which is that you can be critical of the EU as much as you want, and there are plenty of grounds for that. But if the response is simply a retreat into a kind of narrow nationalism, you're going to create a whole set of problems that are going to be quite difficult to address, and that particularly is true for smaller nation states.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it is notable here that Orban, is, unlike, someone like Nigel Farage, who's also a speaker at NatCon, is not an advocate of exiting the EU, right? He and his sort of a handful of like-minded people seem to want to reshape it into something that will serve their national interests better than the current system. And so to that extent, it seems there is perhaps a nascent attempt to, reimagine what this kind of, supranational organization could look like along more conservative terms. But you don't see a huge amount, because everything is articulated in terms of this nationalist rejection of universalism, as you put it, you don't necessarily see all that many specifics being hashed out. So I think, in part, your article is a call for a more robust consideration of what the alternatives to the alternatives to this kind of ultimately false and quite destructive, potentially destructive opposition between the national and the supranational, or the kind of particular and the universal, might be.
Yeah, I think you see the way that this idea of a kind of international movement of nationalisms and its silliness is things to do with China, for instance. Obviously Trumpism is about, and American nationalism involves confrontation with China, right? But it has also involved, to some extent, or at least theorists of it and sort of internet commentators on it and sympathizers with it, have noted that it also involves a kind of emulation of China in some ways, right? Because we're looking at China's mercantilism and China's, um, nationalist economic policy, and to some extent, maybe social policies that impose a measure of sort of cohesion and so on and so forth, and emulating them, but emulating them only in order to prevail in like a zero-sum competition with China. But that context gets lost by certain like people who are sort of internet intellectuals or internet meme makers or things like that, who conceive of these fusion ideas like, like MAGA communism or things like this. They're, which is silly, but it's a variant of a larger trend of thinking that imagines that in some ways that it would be possible for, America and Russia and China to all be kind of in solidarity with one another on the basis of their common embrace of nationalism, their common embrace of mercantilism, or as against, a hegemonic liberal order, which of course is silly because the essence of, those programs is that they're designed for competition. They're designed for winning a competition, like Europe on the, in the eve of World War I is filled with nationalist groups. They do not say, let's fight for the common, cause of nationalism. That's not, let's fight together for the common cause of nationalism. Nationalism is antagonistic. It's inherently antagonistic. You don't, because of the fact that Russia is nationalist and Germany is nationalist, does not mean that Russia and Germany are therefore friends. So that to me is like, it's so obvious, and yet it seems like national conservatism wants to elide that, which is a symptom of just being very unmaterial, which is something Compact talks about, is that when you just like are I just criticize vulgar materialism, but at the same time, if you reduce everything to ideology, and imagine that coalitions and international movements are formed on the basis of shared values and principles, then you can become a little bit confused, so I think that's an issue to bear in mind. And so the question is now, like, what are we? I don't know. I have this. I feel very unsatisfied with nationalism. I'm also not prepared to be an uncritical defender of the EU order, because I'm also not a kind of I guess a Hanania style elitist who just thinks that whoever holds the power and whoever has prevailed, conservatism is about defending their prerogatives and power. I took a lot of inspiration from this moment in which the conservatives and the rabble seem to be synonymous, and so I'm not totally opposed to that, but I'm still trying to think about what is a conservatism that can kind of can grow up to this international world, that can respond to a world that really is international, that can't really be put easily back into national boxes. And one thing that helps us think about this is the international past and the international conservatism of the past.
And that's a good place to leave it. So,
Okay.
yeah, thanks, Hamilton, for joining us again. And for this essay, what NatCon can learn from Metternich. Listeners, please remember that Compact is an independent reader-supported publication, and we need your subscriptions to keep doing what we're doing. Subscribing for just $9 a month or $90 a year gets you full access to all of our content, as well as priority access to Compact events. Please also remember to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite channels, and if you like what we're doing, give us 5 stars. Thanks, and see you next time.